Mark. Mark Kleiman.
Hello, Glenn Loury. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Welcome to the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, Mark. This is going to be the first of many conversations we're going to have at this venue, is it not?
I hope so.
Okay. Well,
so
Glenn
introduce
Loury.
myself?
Yeah, you should introduce yourself. I will introduce myself. As if I need no introduction, Glenn Loury at Brown University in Blogging Heads.
Mark Kleiman, UCLA, and the National Institute of Justice, where I'm a visiting fellow.
Mark, you and I were colleagues at the Kennedy School in the 1980s, man.
Oh, come on, we're not that old. I don't.
Oh, no. Anybody looking at you knows you're that old, Mark. And the same goes with me. I mean, my gray is showing. No?
I know. It's terrible.
But that's a long time. That's a long time. In the world of public policy, I'm asking you to reminisce about those Kennedy School days back in the 80s. I mean, when the Kennedy School were these the golden years of the Kennedy School, our youth?
And actually, I would date the golden years of the Kennedy School back to when I was a student there, when it was much smaller and more intellectually serious. But that probably was not a sustainable model. When I was a student at the Kennedy School, our full-time faculty included Richard Neustadt, Tom Schelling, Francis Batour, Fred Mosteller, Howard Rafa, Michael Spence, Phil Hyde.
Okay, I'm impressed.
It was a pretty spectacular group for 25 of us.
But, Mark, I know, but when I got there in the 1980s, most of those people were still around. Mosteller was not around. Yeah. Spence was chairman of the economics department, but most of those people were still around. So it was your heyday, but the Kennedy School grew beyond this brilliant core. Did it necessarily get diluted as it grew beyond the core, in your opinion, and sort of less intellectual seriousness? That's a stunning charge, Mark.
Certainly the student group got diluted.
Okay.
We went from a situation where editors of the Harvard Law Review were competing to get into the Kennedy School, and we had a limited number of slots, to where people were using the Kennedy School because they couldn't get into the business school. But it was certainly, when we were there, it was a first-rate place, and remains a first-rate place.
I think about Harvard in those years, and we've known each other for such a long time, Mark, because we've come here in the wake of the death recently of James Q. Wilson, the political scientist and criminologist and social analyst of great distinction, who's passed away and who was a good friend and close acquaintance of both of us in our respective ways, and whom we both known for a very long time. I first met Jim in those years, just before I came to the Kennedy School faculty in the early 1980s, when I was a professor at Harvard in economics and Afro-American studies. But it's Jim's passing that puts me in mind of those years.
Yeah, it's sad. I saw Jim in December at his last meeting as chairman of the Committee on Law and Justice of the National Research Council, and you were also there. And he seemed healthy and vigorous. And this was pretty unexpected. It was a shame back then that we didn't have either Wilson or Pat Moynihan involved with the Kennedy School. The distinction between the Kennedy School and Arts and Sciences has always been, I think, a weakness for both units. So I didn't really know him back then. I was the student of his student, Mark Moore. But I knew him as the author of Thinking About Crime, which I'd read and which came as a big shock. Read long before I was interested in crime professionally, and it came as a great shock to me.
The book came as a shock to you.
Yeah, I mean, I had absorbed more or less the standard liberal pieties about crime, and Wilson convinced me I was wrong.
Well, hold on. Let me argue with you for a minute, even before you even get to say anything worth arguing about. But liberal pieties about crime. So why this arch and partisan characterization of the terrain. Is the intellectual terrain on problems of social policy and social control necessarily most usefully divided into liberal pieties and whatever hard-headedness that you're going to associate yourself with? I mean, isn't that a pretty arch way of looking at the world? A lot of people trying to figure out some really hard problems. They vary in their ideological stripe, but we don't really have to, pose the conflict in that way, or do we? Question to you, Mark Kleiman.
Well, as a completely unreconstructed liberal.
Oh, please! I'm not sure I believe that. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I've been pretty consistent in my loyalties. I am a partisan, and I'm ashamed of it. We play a partisan game in this country, and I'm dissatisfied with my side on what seems to me an important issue, and what seems to many people on my side not to be an important issue, to be a mere epiphenomenon of other social ills, something that will go away when we fix everything else, and that strikes me as wrong-headed. And I think that our failure on this topic partly explains the conservative hegemony for much of your adult lifetime and mine. Which is not to say that I think the conservatives had the right view on crime.
Okay, hold on, Mark. Don't change. I mean, let's just deal with one piece at a time. I mean, I hear you.
Right.
First, you were talking about the liberals. Then we're going to talk about the conservatives. Of the liberals, you just said they're wrong-headed about crime. You got awakened to that by Jim Wilson's book. And the liberal wrong-headedness about crime is substantially responsible for the conservative hegemony. Do I do your view justice?
Substantially may be too strong, but certainly that was a piece of it.
Okay. Well, because I want to respond to that.
Because the population was concerned about crime, and it looked as if liberal politicians mostly weren't.
Okay, so I think crime is just one piece of a very big puzzle. Okay, I think crime is crime, and it's not unimportant, and yes, we ought to pay attention to it, but it is not a thing unto itself. And I think that if we take a big, broad view and a big historical view, what we're going to see is that coming out of the middle of the 20th century, there's an implosion in the center of the American metropolis. Okay, there's deep social dysfunction, and a lot of systems are failing. Many systems are failing. Okay. One manifestation of this broad social failure, which is right at the heart of the American democratic project, okay, one aspect of that is crime. Now, liberals may not have been saying the right things about public safety, but I would rather pose the question as, which ideology of social function, of social responsibility, of mutual relation, of kind of political philosophy and governing vision, which ideology, coming out of the decades after the Second World War and moving into the 1970s and the 1980s and the post-civil rights environment, which broad view of the matter is sort of more consistent with our values, is closer to being somehow historically right, is more well-suited to ameliorating the conditions of suffering, disadvantage, and so forth in the society, and so on. Now, to dismiss liberalism because they didn't get the punishment question right in 1975, postulating that they didn't, we could come back and argue that, is just too quick of a move. So, this is why I asked the question, why did we divide the terrain into this kind of, liberals and so forth. Anyway, I talked too much. I think I made my point. You said liberals got the crime question wrong, and I'm asking you.
I don't want to.
I'm asking you.
I don't want to dismiss liberalism.
Okay, very good.
I want to fix it. I want to remind it of truths that were written down by Machiavelli, which is that the desire to give and not to punish needs to be restrained. That the decent person, the liberal in politics, needs to learn some lessons, needs to learn to be able not to be good. And I was taught that by Jim Wilson and by my friend Glenn Loury.
Wait!
who also helped awaken me from my liberal dogmatic slumber back when he was on a different side of the aisle.
Okay.
What happened to him?
Well, I'm getting ready to. I'm getting ready to tell you about that. Okay, I'm not sure.
So I want to remember. I want to remember both the fundamental truths of liberalism, as I understand them, and its frailties. And I want to remind my liberal friends that the purposes we serve and the constituencies we intend to help, especially poor people and people in socially disadvantaged groups, are especially disadvantaged by crime. And that if we don't get serious about what to do about crime, we impose needless suffering. And I'm frustrated because we made a lot of progress in knowing what to do about crime. We could have a lot less crime and a lot fewer people behind bars than we have now, in ways that I think are fairly well easy to define. And it's hard to get much political traction for that.
Okay, Mark.
There's still a belief that if we just added one more social service, everything would get better. And that seems to me not justified by the facts.
Well, hold on. I mean, there's just too much on the table. First of all, I have to remark upon your characterization of the old Glenn and the new Glenn. The old Glenn, who with James Q. Wilson opened your eyes to certain frailties of the liberal frame, and the new Glenn, who has now switched to the other side, quote unquote, need to respond to that. Also, I think need to frame for the viewers exactly what we're talking about here, because I think there's a particular intellectual moment or period where, that this is around the time of the birth of neoconservatism as a domestic ideology, this liberals mugged by reality, this dubiousness about the hopefulness of all of these various reform projects, this kind of hard-headedness about certain realities that one has to confront. As I have said, that's an intellectual posture, not only with respect to the crime policy question, but across a broad front. And I think what we're talking about, that is the context of this little tension in our conversation right now, has to do with how, I remember Nat Glazer. I'm just going to give one example. This is the sociologist at Harvard who wrote a book about affirmative action. I think he called it affirmative discrimination or something like that. Or I remember Abigail Thernstrom. This is another scholar who's writing about the Voting Rights Act. And, these people were both liberals or Democrats at one point in their trajectory of intellectual development, but who found themselves progressively more kind of right of center because of the way they reacted to this, kind of moment in American history coming out of the 1960s, and especially with around the race questions. Crime is and punishment and policing and prisons are also a part of this dealing with the race question. Mark, I don't think you would dispute that. So I'm just trying to put it into this sort of broad frame. In other words, it's not just a nail sticking up that needs to be hammered down and the liberals have got the wrong hammer. Crime, this discrete thing that we're now going to react to with a sensible policy analytic frame. It is one part of this sort of broader set of social issues, like, the failing. You say one more social program, you want to tell us that one more social program won't solve the problem. For my part, I'm not talking about discrete programs. I'm talking about a complete orientation and definition of what our problem is. In other words, a devotion to increasing the life possibilities of people who are at the margins of our society would, of course, require programs. There isn't any doubt about that. But that would be like a political position, not a policy position. But anyway, I ramble, and I ought to at least give you a chance to respond to that. But I got to come back also later to this thing about the old Glenn and the new Glenn, because I don't really think there's an old Glenn and a new Glenn. But you want to respond to what I've just been rambling on about?
Well, no. I don't at all disagree that we need some different policies, particularly to change the income distribution, and do some other things. I would assert that getting smart on crime control is a central part of that. That it may be true, it certainly is true, that crime goes along with other problems in communities. But it's not true that crime will go away if we just focus on everything else. As Phil Cook has remarked, while it's true that concentrated sustained poverty is correlated with crime, and in some sense causes crime, it's also the case that the crime is one of the sustaining causes of concentrated poverty. It drives people and resources out of communities. It drives opportunities out of communities. And you wind up with places where there aren't many opportunities and aren't many services, aren't many people who can afford to be elsewhere. And that's a bad place to be. So I don't think we can actually deal with the rest of the problem unless we deal with, for example, the homicide rate. Now we've made a lot of progress. I mean, we're back to, pardon me, roughly 1960 levels of homicide, and that's a good thing. But there's a way to go, and in a lot of the neighborhoods that you and I are both thinking about, homicide remains the leading cause of death for men 15 to 30. That's not acceptable.
Yeah, I know the statistics, but here's what I want to say about that. I mean, I think, and I don't know if you would agree or not, spiking in the homicide rate is a secular trend, had a lot to do with drug trafficking in urban neighborhoods, especially crack. And I think that laws about the legalization of narcotics have nothing to do with people who live in inner city neighborhoods and the kind of crime control strategies that one might deploy in response to violence on the street, and everything to do with the tenor of American politics that might be set by a suburban voter or somebody in Iowa or Michigan or South Carolina in a national kind of moralistic tug of war about how the law is going to express our values. I'm sorry if that seems kind of convoluted what I just said, but what I mean to say is, again, this homicide in urban communities, okay? So it's high. It's also high on Indian reservations. I mean, I'll bet if we looked across societies in the world, we find a lot of underlying determinants. I don't know what urban Brazil homicide looks like and how it varies across different socio-demographic and so forth and so on. I bet we find a lot of reasons why homicide rates would vary. The idea that getting tough on crime, I mean, it's like you want to do politics here, big political questions, okay? And you want to do it through a kind of a small bore policy analytic frame. You don't want to ask the largest questions, which are the ones that I think that we should be grappling with. I'm sorry, Mark. That probably seems very unfair. I'm sorry.
I have no objection to grappling with larger questions, but one way to grapple with larger questions is to get smaller questions right. And I came to disagree. I actually never fully agreed with the conservative view on crime, which is that bad people deserve to be punished, and punishing them is good, and we should enjoy it. That was never my view. But I did come to believe that punishment was sometimes necessary, and that we had to learn to do it economically in the broadest sense, that is to say, inflicting as little suffering as possible in the process of reducing the suffering inflicted by crime. And I don't apologize for being serious about that, and it seems to me both liberals and conservatives got the problem badly wrong. And part of the reason the conservative view triumphed in the population was that liberals were denying that there was a problem. And that's never a
I can't accept that, Mark. I can't accept. The conservative view in South Carolina or Mississippi or Texas or in Ohio or Idaho or Nevada, the conservative view triumphed because liberals got it wrong? I mean, please, really? American political culture is what it is because liberals have failed to be realistic? I mean, the jingoistic character of our public discourse, the kind of sort of deep reactionary elements that you can see in, I don't know, the Republican primary contest right now, that's due to liberals having gotten it wrong? I mean, please, Mark, I can't buy that. You're gonna pile it all on the Kerner Commission report. Let's go back to 1968. Okay, the cities are burning. 1968, you got riots in the cities. This is very important because I think this was a formative period for a lot of people, including James Q. Wilson. Cities are burning. Okay, now there are responses to that. George Wallace runs for president in 1968. He certainly would have agreed with you that the liberals had their heads up their butts. Okay. Pat Moynihan has a line that he takes in 1968, which aims to be a kind of middling line. He goes to work for Richard Nixon. He writes a memo called Benign Neglect, etc. You think that the liberals are responsible for what comes out in 1968 and 1972? You think that the liberals' willingness to get tough on crime is responsible for the people in Macomb County, Michigan, around Detroit, voting for Ronald Reagan in 1980? Please. You think liberals drove the labor union, working class ethnics in the Democratic Party into the arms of the Republicans? I'm sorry, Mark. I don't buy that one bit.
I don't think that the being.
I think. Let me finish my thought. I'm sorry, I didn't. But I just want to finish the thought. I don't buy it one bit. I think that the reactionary turn that has accommodated a massive expansion of social control institutions in this country, historically unprecedented rise of the carceral state, cannot be laid at the feet of liberals. It's all too American. Okay, it's prohibition acted out again, only this time the fodder for the moral crusade and self-congratulatory coercion that is going on are the blacks and the brown poor in the urban ghettos. And crime is just a cover for a massive political subjugation coming out of the 1960s, which is really a reaction against a lot of things that a lot of people didn't want to accommodate in America. Anyway, now I'm ranting, and I know I'm ranting, so I apologize for the rant, but at least you know what I think.
Right, and I don't completely disagree. But it's also the case that the promise of social peace that was part of the sort of Great Society crusade wasn't delivered on. Right? We had massive changes for what you and I would consider the better in the 1960s across a very wide range of policies with very strong public support. And we had a huge crime wave. And I think a lot of ordinary voters looked around and said, what? You guys must not know what you're doing. And there was evidence for that. So again, I want to remind you, I was never on the other side. I've never voted for a Republican presidential candidate in my life. But I do think in this particular regard, a certain soft-heartedness leading to soft-headedness served both the political movement of liberalism and its constituency very badly. Which is not to say that I think that the hard-heartedness masquerading as hard-headedness on the conservative side served anybody any better. I think we've had two quite perverse tendencies in dealing with the crime issue. And I'm hoping to overcome both of them. But I remain grateful to Jim Wilson and Glenn Loury for reminding me that my original view was not complete, needed to be corrected. And I still think that was right. And I don't apologize for wanting to exert social control over people who hurt other people and take their stuff. I have said before that the only problem with it.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I've said before the only problem with the American crime debate is that, particularly at the academic level, is that it's conducted between the disciples of Michel Foucault, who are worried about the carceral state and excessive social control, and the disciples of the Marquis de Sade. And if you've got an idea that's too carceral for the Foucaultians and not mean enough for the sadists, you're out of luck.
Mark, can you just
true.
address yourself to this question then, if you would?
Yeah.
How is it that every other industrial democracy, some of them with quite diverse ethnically and racially populations, managed to get through the 20th century and into the 21st century, subject to the human tendency to hurt other people and take their stuff, as you put it, without constructing the institutions of social control with which we are here in the United States beset? How did they manage to do that?
Partly because their criminal justice systems are less under democratic control than ours are. So if you look, for example, at attitudes about capital punishment, which you and I will agree is a fairly primitive way to think about crime control. Capital punishment is just about as popular in Great Britain as it is in the U.S., but it doesn't matter. Their political institutions are not responsive to public opinion at that level. And the elite opinion that says that capital punishment is a wrong and foolish idea, primitive idea, remains in control. We elect 3,000 district attorneys in this country. That accounts for a lot of our more savage approach to crime control.
Well, that's so much to our discredit then, isn't it? I mean, my observation had 2 points. One was, as a policy matter, evidently there's more than one path in the forest here. Okay? In other words, there are ways of responding to the reality of the fact of crime in society without erecting the institutions that we've got. So as a policy matter, there's more than one path in the forest. But I like your observation that we have the institutions we have because of politics. We have the institutions that we, the people of the United States, have chosen. To which I want to say, why should the practice of how you deal with these most crucial matters of the resolution of dispute, injury, and violation of social code within a society, why should that be under the control of popular passions? That's not by any means obvious to me what a democracy or what a decent society would want to do. So I ask you to respond to both points. One point is, evidently there are other ways of managing the fact that people live in cities and bad people are amongst us than what we've chosen. So pointing out that it's there does not justify what we've got. And secondly, isn't it to the discredit of the United States that we have this kind of crime politics where people who live in suburbs vote for district attorneys, who act out rituals of social anxiety over and against the least advantaged people in the society who are mostly black and brown?
I would refer you to cities such as Baltimore. Baltimore is 70% black the last time I checked. Elects not only its own mayor who appoints the police chief, but its own district state's attorney, because Baltimore is a county of Maryland. You do not see in Baltimore radically different policies than places where it's suburban voters who elect the DA. As I've heard you say before, the attitude on crime that is the sort of official progressive attitude is not the attitude of the people who live in high crime neighborhoods. They are indeed outraged by the excesses of police and by excessive incarceration, but they're also outraged by the fact that somehow crime gets tolerated in their neighborhoods when it wouldn't be tolerated in the suburbs. Both of those strains are very strong. David Kennedy's book, Don't Shoot, is very good on that. So yeah, I think that I don't for a second want to suggest that having 2.4 million people behind bars is a good idea. It's a terrible idea. But I'm disappointed that the good folks, my side of the argument, didn't come up with something smarter to do, which we didn't. In my little piece of
hold on. I'm sorry. I just want to be clear on this. There were no counter proposals coming from liberal criminology to the problem of social control other than 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimums, other than solitary confinement in supermax prisons, other than a war on drugs funded through federal largesse and a complex system of interjurisdictional blah, 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 blah. There were no alternative policies. The liberals had no ideas. What we're doing is the necessary thing to do in response to a social problem because the conservatives are the only one, like James Q. Wilson, who are thinking about crime.
No, you're conflating 2 different ideas. Right. One is that the conservative approach, which is not fully identifiable with Jim Wilson, was right, which I don't think it was. And the other was that there was a coherent liberal alternative. In fact, most liberal criminology consists of being opposed to all the things you just said. But when you ask, and what do you want to do about crime, you hear a lot of crickets. So, for example, let me just take my little piece of the planet. I'm interested in what to do with the offenders we don't put in prison, right? So there's many more people on probation, on parole, or on pretrial release waiting trial than there are behind bars.
Yep.
At the moment, we do a very bad job of both helping them and controlling them. And so of the people who get out of prison, about 60% are back in prison within 3 years. There's a program called HOPE in Hawaii, which is consistent with some work I did, though I didn't invent it. It shows that if you, instead of threatening people with revocation after a string of violations, promise them a short jail stay after every violation, In this case, mostly showing up positive on a drug test or not showing up. If you do that, you can reduce their new crimes by 50%, and you can reduce their time behind bars by 50%, and you can reduce their drug use by 80%. Now, those are all good things to do, it seems to me, compared to putting them in prison. That's what I think of as a sensible liberal policy that doesn't respond to every crime by locking people up for a long time.
Mark, I've read When Brute Force Fails, and I think the viewers at bloggingheads.tv have heard you talk about When Brute Force Fails. So we appreciate your reprise of the argument, and you're pointing to some evidence, fragmentary as it is, not yet a scientifically demonstrated proposition, but perhaps worth investigating, that certain modifications of post-release supervision might yield some positive benefits. But I would like to draw...
Glenn, let me stop you there. Let me stop you
there.
Right. Not scientifically demonstrated. We have a 500-person randomized controlled trial showing the results I just named. That's better science than we have for most of us.
It's one study, Mark. I mean, would I evaluate whether or not employment training worked on the basis of there having been one program that demonstrated some success, or for that matter, some failure? It's one study. I mean, okay.
How many times have you heard about Perry Preschool?
Quite a few.
How much theorizing has been built
the same
on that
point,
single, not very well-run experiment?
The same point would apply. It oughtn't to have been done, or at least the ideological impulse that would drive writers to rely on that one study to make broad and sweeping claims would just be the left side counterpart, or no, perhaps I shouldn't put it in left and right terms, would be just a counterpart of what it is that I think you're doing. And I don't mean to be saying that I don't think hope is worth looking at. I just mean to be saying, come on, we found the magic bullet and this is it. I mean, I would suggest a bit more modesty and a little bit more replication across a broad set of varying situations before I came to that conclusion. But this is another conversation. I mean, it's like these development economies.
Well, it's not fully another conversation, because what's striking is the disinterest of the liberal foundations, which are generous in supporting a variety of drug treatment research, in studying this. This is a non-starter for many people, because it addresses drug abuse without drug treatment, and that's a no-no. Despite a long history of research on drug treatment with completely underwhelming results. So yeah, it's not as if I want to completely rely on one study.
Hold on just a moment, Mark. Hold on just a moment. Hold on. Don't go off the line.
Yep.
Sorry for that, Mark. I had to respond to the doorbell here, but it kept ringing. Okay, so
it's not the case that I want to rely on one study. I want to do more studies. I want to go back and look at the results from
Mark, and you were lamenting about the liberal foundations. Okay, enough on hope. I get it. Okay, I'm just saying no magic bullet. I don't mind asking the question. And moreover, yes, scientific. I mean, you say. Change the regime in which you respond to these guys. Test them regularly and give them short bursts of punishment immediately after, should they relapse. Proven to reduce 80%, 50%, 30%. And all I'm saying is, if you're going to throw numbers around like that, I would like to see it having been demonstrated, replicated, and reproduced in a lot of different settings. And, I'm for your project of trying to get funds in order to be able to expand that. I'd like to see other investigators getting involved in it too. If I were on the board of the foundation, I would vote to fund such studies so that we could investigate such things. But I don't think the debate about that kind of small bore, with respect, policy intervention, is a substitute for a debate about the politics of punishment, inequality, power, coercion, and so forth that we ought to be having. Shall we move on this? Yeah, go ahead. I was going to suggest
about what are called reentry programs. Right? There's very fashionable, very well funded. There's another fashionable and well funded movement called the drug courts, which is a coerced treatment approach. And I look at the data in those programs, and the data, it's not just OI, we've got a couple of replications for both at small scale, and say, wait a second, no, we do have a magic bullet here. It turns out that, the principles of sensible parenting, the principles that Baccaria laid out for centuries ago, are correct.
I'm sorry. No, wait a minute. Hold on. I object. Now, forget about hope, or can we move on? Because I want to talk about the intellectual framework here. The principles of sensible parenting, or the observations about human nature from 2 centuries ago, tell us how to handle drug users. This is something that we know. Now, is that science? Is that
not drug users. I'm not particularly interested in drug users. I'm interested in people who commit felonies, theft.
And I'm interested in the connection between sensible parenting and what public institutions do with people who break the laws. And I'm interested in the intellectual cast of mind that thinks that there's some truth. I put the word in inverted commas. That's implicit in that comparison. This is the pseudoscience that I want to indict here, and with which I say, again, with respect, I fear that I would have to associate some of the writings of James Q. Wilson as well. But, I mean, really? Human nature is so black and white and straightforward to us that we know these things about people? Sensible parenting and dealing with offenders after they've been released are kind of cousin problems.
What's consistent is the fact that human beings, and this is the findings of the current wave of behavioral economics, don't respond the way the Economics 101 rational actor responds. They respond much more sharply to things that happen right away than to things that are even slightly deferred. And they respond much more strongly to things that are certain to happen than to things that are only possible to happen. And they respond much more strongly to stuff that's obviously fair than to stuff that's apparently random. And we've unfortunately built a criminal justice system based on the random application of severity rather than the consistent application of small sanctions. And yes, I think that's something fundamental about human nature that turns out to be true across a wide variety of domains. And we failed to apply it in this quite important set of areas. And that's not either good for the victims of those crimes or for the perpetrators who, after all, are doing very badly under our current system. We've designed a system that encourages people to do wrong things and be punished for them. That's not the system we wanted to design. And if it weren't involved in liberals could think about it more clearly. Now, again, every time I criticize liberalism, you keep saying, does that mean you're on the other side? No, it doesn't.
No, I'm not really
on our side. I want to make things better.
Hold on.
And I think that a certain ideology has kept us from seeing what would make things better.
No, I'm not buying your definition of the terrain. I mean, I find you're casting the argument in those terms revelatory about you, not about the argument. With respect, I don't mean that in an ad hominem fashion. I just mean to say it's a particular way of viewing the world. I mean, liberals got it wrong in the 1970s. We never somehow have gotten over that. That's the whole, as I say, the domestic side of neoconservatism is basically defined by that impulse. Okay? And I think liberals being wrong is not enough. It's not enough to be right about liberals having been wrong, particularly if in the wake of my lamenting the failures of liberalism, institutions of social control, of the extent that I've already lamented, come into being. But I want to ask you another kind of question, Mark, because I want to press the intellectual aspect of James Q. Wilson's contribution. What do you think of the book Crime and Human Nature, 1985, a book that Richard Herrnstein and James Q. Wilson co-authored that sets out to review what is known about the constitutional, biological, and temperamental underpinnings, that is, the human nature underpinnings of criminal behavior? I assume you've read the book, and I'd like to know what you think about it as a piece of intellectual labor within this field that you spent your life working in.
I've read it. It's not actually, it's a piece of social psychology, which is sort of outside my intellectual wheelhouse. I thought there were parts of it that were illuminating. I thought there were parts of it that were unduly reductionist.
What about the project?
Interestingly,
what about undertaking the project, Crime and Human Nature. What about setting down to go through how the glandular system works? What evidence is there about the relationship between the shape of the body and musculature and skeletal structure and criminal behavior? What do we know about, as I say, the constitutional factors that incline some people to, quote, criminality, close quote? I'm asking you whether or not that intellectual framing of the problem, and again, I know I rant and I apologize, is to your liking.
Is it to my liking?
Well, what do you have to say about it? But I mean, okay.
No, but do I think it has a real contribution to make? Yes. And somebody who's read Crime and Human Nature, unlike anybody who'd read any of the rest of the literature in criminology, would be unsurprised by the apparent finding that our unexpected drop in crime was due partly to getting lead out of the environment. Right? I mean, that's not an idea that would ordinarily appeal to an ordinary criminologist, but once you start to ask about the constitutional questions, then it seems natural to say, wait a second, is there stuff in the environment that weakens people's self-command in a way that leads them to hurt other people and take their stuff in the face of punishment? The answer turns out to be yes, and if we take some of that stuff out of the environment, we'll have less crime without doing any fundamental fixing of American society. I mean, I guess what you're reacting to in Crime and Human Nature is its focus on the individual and the constitutional as opposed to the social. Now, I think each of those foci is partial. And a sensible theory about crime and punishment would include both the constitutional and the social.
Excuse me, that's not what I'm reacting to. What I'm reacting to is the pretense of science. Politics masters science. What I'm reacting to is pseudoscience. What I'm reacting to is claims that we can know something on the basis of the feeble evidence that is at hand deeply enough to warrant the kind of conclusions or the kind of judgments that people come to based on human nature. That's what I'm objecting to. And I don't think yes, the effect of lead on behavior. Is lead responsible for the crime? I defy you to demonstrate that. I thought it was abortion that was responsible for the crime. And I say that tongue in cheek. I say that to say there's 10 different arguments out there about what's responsible for secular trends in crime rates. And actually demonstrating, that is, showing with econometric certitude that the causal mechanism is any one of them is virtually impossible. So
why should it be any one of them? Why should it be several of them at once?
Okay, and then assessing their relative magnitude, given the empirical evidence that is at hand and the difficulty of the inference problem, is virtually impossible. I mean, a lot of these questions are not scientific questions, it seems to me, at the end of the day, although evidence can be brought to bear on them. I wouldn't be against evidence-based argument, but I wouldn't want it to be driven by a pretense of scientific certitude when no such certitude can possibly exist. And for me, that's the problem.
We need a lot less than certitude. We need a lot less than certitude to look at the data that have been gathered on lead and gasoline and crime. And look, I'm probably more skeptical about econometrics than you are, because I'm not as skilled at it. I still think that the answer to the question, is it possible to take the con out of econometrics, is an open one. But based on those results, I would say, if I were put in charge of controlling crime in the U.S., I would spend the $30 billion to get all of the lead out of the remaining residential buildings. That looks to me like an expenditure well worth making based on the data we now have about lead and crime, and of course lead and lots of other outcomes. That's, it seems to me, what science is good for. You don't need anything like certitude to say, gee, we should explore that area. We should explore the area of the conditions under which children are brought up within their families and whether they can be improved by doing a little coaching of the parents. That's the nurse-family partnership idea. Now, neither removing lead from the environment nor nurse-family partnership is what you would call a classically conservative program. One is regulation of business, and the other is social spending. And our friend Jim Wilson embraced them both, even though he remained a staunch conservative, because his view of the evidence suggested they'd do something about crime and other bad things. And I think he was right. And I think if you think about crime and human nature as a complete theory of crime and crime control, it's way deficient. But so is the other tradition that it critiques. So I still assign pieces of that book. There's good stuff in there. And the body typing stuff, which is completely weird and out to lunch, does seem to have some data behind it. I don't think you need anything very complicated to explain why heavily muscled people with not very sensitive nervous systems are more likely to engage in assaultive behavior. They're likely to be more successful at it, and it hurts less when they get hurt. But are the data wrong? I mean, just because it seems weird and primitive to us, because it's not sociology or econometrics, doesn't mean it's not a piece of the truth.
No, it feels like highbrow journalism to me, as much as anything. It feels like narrative construction, where you weave these things together and it tells a particular tale. It doesn't feel like science at all.
Isn't that true of the cultural criticism that you've started to embrace? I mean, isn't the whole story about the carceral state a piece of narrative construction with very weak science behind it?
Well, that's where the deconstructionist argument leads. I mean, the critical theorist acknowledges that it's all about narrative construction, and then the question becomes which narrative and the criteria for judging are not going to be scientific. They're going to be power-based and political. And this is another thing that I want to say about this kind of work. It doesn't take place in a vacuum, I'm reminded of the turn of the 20th century when the North and South were trying to reconcile a generation or two after the Civil War, when the blacks were moving into the big cities, as were European working class, lower class migrants coming into the big cities of the industrializing America. And I'm reminded of, Friedrich Hoffman published a book. He's a demographer. He makes his claim to fame is that he uses data from Philadelphia Penitentiary on the mortality rates amongst black and white inmates to argue that the higher mortality rate amongst blacks was proof of their weaker constitutional, endowments and such. He goes on to write a book called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. This is all in this period of dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War and the social upheavals of the emancipation of the slaves. I zip forward 100 years, Mark. I see the aftermath of the failure of the Great Society and the failure of the Civil Rights Revolution to actually resolve the problems in our cities. And I see scribblers, not unlike Friedrich Hoffman, who have their data and who have their theories, but who are basically participants in a narrative construction of rationalization and justification of institutions of brute force and of, distributive clarity that are going to mark out lines that are going to put some people up and some people down. And I fit James Q. Wilson squarely, and Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray and many others whom I could name, squarely in that late 20th century rationalization of the hard-handed response to the failure to incorporate these African Americans who had migrated to our cities more effectively than we had done. And I think that their hard-hearted and hard-handed response was just one, not the only one, and not right response to that social dilemma of the United States. And I guess I hold it against Jim. I'm sorry. I liked him. I knew him very well for 30 years. But I regret very much the role that I feel that he and his fellow travelers played in the intellectual rationalization and justification of the abandonment of this underclass that we now barely bother to talk about anymore in our cities. Again, I ranted, but at least you know what I think.
Right, and if you restricted your attention to Charles Murray, I wouldn't have any disagreements. I think that's pseudoscientific, politicized journalism. That doesn't have any real value to add to the debate. I think to conflate Jim Wilson's pretty careful scholarship with that is wrong. I speak, not just as Jim's friend and beneficiary, but as somebody who, looked at. Not to say that there weren't things I would severely criticize about Jim's work.
Hold on, I didn't equate James.
I think his willingness to be open to evidence, which sharply distinguishes him. And the problem with the POMOs is that once they've decided that everything's a narrative, then they're evidence free. They can just construct any narrative that feels good to them and attracts grant funding, and write it down as if it were the same as doing real intellectual work. And that seems to be wrong. It's better, I think, to try to be constrained by the evidence, acknowledging that the evidence is never completely conclusive.
Nobody's advocating ignoring the evidence, and I didn't equate Charles Murray to James Q. Wilson. I said that they were part of an intellectual trend that I likened to something that happened 100 years ago, and that was put in the service of a particular kind of narrative construction. And I want to observe that Charles Murray and James Q. Wilson didn't write together, but they did both write with Richard Herrnstein. I want to observe that Charles Murray, for many years, has been a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where James Q. Wilson was, for many years, chairman of the Board of Academic Advisors. I want to observe what I know personally, which is that before the bell curve, that's 1994, the bell curve, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, was published. James Q. Wilson entertained in his living room at dinner a group of people around a table, of whom I was one, with Charles Murray being another, at which conversation about what was going to be found in the bell curve took place. To a party to the conversation with James Q. Wilson, I have a pretty good idea what he thought about it, and a lot of the stuff that bothered me deeply about the bell curve, the reductionist pseudoscientific effort to explain deep political inequality, which had cultural and social and economic manifestation, by reference to things outside the ambit of politics, therefore had to be taken as given. Hard-headed people would recognize them, such as human nature and such as the hand we've been dealt. That tendency, that way of looking at society and at politics, that way of masking power and inequality is what I'm attributing to James Q. Wilson, and I believe I'm rightly doing it. I'm aware that he's not Charles Murray. He was James Q. Wilson. They were fellow travelers and part of an intellectual band that reacted to the failures of the post-World War II socialization process in the United States in a particular way. I think it was wrong-headed, hard-hearted, and I think it is partly to be blamed for this cul-de-sac, this horrible cul-de-sac that we've gotten ourselves into with over-incarceration. You get the last word, Mark.
Anytime you say something I'm going to disagree with, I'll disagree with you. But that seems to be right. I mean, I think that the conservative tendency about crime was not more correct than the liberal tendency about crime. I think they were both relentlessly partial and need to be corrected. The difference between Charles Murray and Jim Wilson was that Jim was willing to participate in that process. Yes, he was part of a political movement, but that's not all he was. At the end of the day, he was prepared to call out mass incarceration as a problem, and that's something to be celebrated. I still think that looking hard at the technical problem of crime control is not irrelevant to solving our deeper social problems. At least that's the piece of ground I've been given to plow, so I'm going to keep plowing it. But it's always a great pleasure to talk. I hope this is not our last conversation.
Well, it certainly won't be our last conversation about the subject, and it certainly won't be our last conversation at Blogging Heads. Mark, I'm grateful to you for your forbearance in the face of my harangue, and also for your substantive contribution to this, I think, apt celebration of the life of James Q. Wilson. He would have wanted us to argue, and he would have probably predicted a lot of what each of us would have said.
That's correct.
Okay, Mark, take care, and again, thanks a lot.
Take care, Glenn.
Bye-bye.